Thanks, everyone, for joining us at the Project Censored radio show. I'm your co-host this week, Eleanor Goldfield, and we're very glad right now to be joined by Ben Price, who is the Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund's Education Director and a pioneer in the rights of nature movement. In 2006, he organized the first community on Earth to recognize legal rights for nature, and that outlandish act evolved into the global rights of nature movement. And he is also the author of the book that we're going to be talking about today, Wouldn't You Say? A collection of essays about environment and community. Ben, thanks so much for joining us.
Well, thank you so much, Eleanor. Glad to be here.
So I want to start off by saying that you pleasantly surprised me because I've seen a lot of arguments for the rights of nature that sort of polish and whitewash the foundations of our country to suggest that we all have these amazingly progressive and protected rights. So we should just give those rights to nature and that would just be perfect. But you don't sugarcoat the reality of our paltry excuse for a democracy or a republic. You're very honest about the fact that we don't have the rights that we think that we do. And indeed, you point this out in the book. You write, "We keep the economy afloat with laws that favor the right to make a profit over the human right of the people who actually create that profit. And we do it by enslaving the real world that we call nature as a rightless property," end quote. And you point out actually in the next paragraph that our laws actually make it a violation of corporate civil rights for places like East Palestine, Ohio, to ban the transportation of highly toxic chemicals through their communities. And we've had folks from East Palestine on the show talking about that horrific incident and the aftermath. And we've also talked on the show about Citizens United and that, Tesla cars have more rights than we do. But for our listeners, could you just talk to us about whether you feel that what we're seeing now is a perversion of those foundations of the U.S., or this is indeed how it was meant to be all along, and what we're seeing today is different only in the modernity or the manifestation of these tenets, not in the bastardization of them?
Yeah, I would argue that the United States of America, there were some very idealistic ideas that were raised by the true revolutionaries of the time. The Federalists weren't among them. The Federalists were the conservatives, and they wrote the Constitution. They did not, by and large, participate in the rebellion. I'm excluding George Washington and Hamilton and some other folks, but and I could get into, and I do in another book, get into what their reasoning and why they got involved. It was not out of idealism, but it was certainly out of personal interest and particularly land grabbing, essentially. Um, Frankly, where we are today is not a perversion of what the promise of America was in the Declaration of Independence. It is actually a continuation of principles that were laid down, and we identify, for instance, the Enlightenment period in European philosophical development. If you really look at the folks who penned the large tracts that are studied in philosophy classes, their patrons, the folks that actually kept them able to eat and have comfy homes, were paying them to write those things, no less than the marketers who, advertise on television and billboards and magazines and the rest of it. And what I'm getting at is that there are some really foundational principles of our culture that were laid down at that point that contradict reality. And that's really what I try to get at in Wouldn't You Say? It's a collection of essays that frankly began as obviously one essay where I took an idea and I said, none of the premises of the arguments being made by the established system actually hold together when you dig deep enough and ask the hard questions about them. And ideas like property, which is the fundamental principle on which law in the United States is built. Rights attached to property. I'm not saying property rights. The claim to right to own property is not an inalienable right. And now I have to define property a little bit. There's two kinds. There's the kinds that come from your own personal effort, in which case, yes, you have some claim to the product of your labor. But there's the other kind that comes from theft or conquest, or things like, um, the Monroe Doctrine that seems to be coming back to life again. Greenland, it's in North America, so it must belong to the United States. Same with Panama, Canada, Mexico, all of it. I mean, we've seen those arguments before, and we've seen the pushback against them that was heard but not heeded. What I'm trying to do in Wouldn't You Say is tease apart ideas like property, claim to own property. Where does it come from? Where and how does it exist? And can you find it in the real world empirically? Does it exist as an actual thing? And as it turns out, if you dig deep enough, it's actually no, it's a relationship between a particular individual or group with the thing that they claim to own. It's that relationship. It's that actually a power dynamic between the person or claimed owners and the thing. And without the law to coerce everyone else in society to honor and believe in the idea of that monopoly privilege to own and control and to eliminate everyone else, and to say, no, you can't trespass here. No, you can't use my whatever. You can't profit from the corporation you work for in the way you want to because you don't make those decisions. We own it. So it's really about how law creates and upholds that relationship coercively. Really, the doctrine of discovery that was used to justify the expansion of European empires, starting with England, um, enclosing the commons, places where everyone lived. And there was no claim of ownership prior to the enclosures. And so fences and walls and moats and everything else built around them. And the people who used to live there excluded, with nowhere to raise food, nowhere to raise families, and then made criminalized by the law. Back to the law. The law actually creates these dynamics and these power relationships. In the United States, we have these myths, back from the early days of the revolutionary thought, that the argument was, well, law should protect rights. Law should actually protect the equality of all. I mean, that's quite a vision. That's quite a laudable idea. But it wasn't allowed to come to fruition. Tom Paine, who wrote Common Sense and argued desperately against the illogic of an aristocracy, of a hierarchical culture. He wasn't a Marxist. He preceded Marx. It didn't have all of that economic baggage. It wasn't all about economics. He didn't see everything just about a relationship to materialism, in other words. He saw it in terms of simple logic, common sense. Why should one person wearing a white wig and fancy clothes have more say and more privileges than the person who makes his food and clothes? And so common sense, unfortunately, is something that we lost. Just a side note, it's interesting to note that Tom Paine, who actually inspired the American Revolution, is not memorialized anywhere in Washington, D.C. There isn't a statue, there isn't a monument, there is no bust in the Capitol, because that's not the model that the Federalists actually wanted to follow. So that's just one example. When I talk about property, though, it connects into that other thing that I've been very committed to now since 2006, with the first rights of nature law being enacted in Tamaqua, Pennsylvania. And that is, can the natural world be property? Can it be a slave to its owners, as human beings were constitutionally in the United States until 1865? And according to lawmakers today, the answer is yes. According to common sense, I
Mm.
would argue the answer is no.
Mm.
And I don't want to just keep going, but in some ways I can keep connecting all of the essays because that's the point. It's all connected.
Mhm.
Nature, what we call nature, is everything other than human beings, which is an interesting thing to say when you think about it. There's only one reality. There's only one reality, but in our culture, we divide it. We bifurcate reality into human and non-human. And the non-human part, we other with the word nature, as though we're not part of it because we're superior to it. That's the Enlightenment argument. But when you dig down deeper, it's really not that case at all. It's only certain human beings who are superior. And they're superior to not just what's called nature, but human beings who are too close to what's called nature, human beings who actually live and subsist on the real world, reality, that are actually still integrated into that continuum of reality. And so there's a big argument here that's being made over 18 different essays in this book. And it's about our mistaken ideas, our false premises that justify what we call justice in the United States, that justify the law. And the law is a very peculiar thing. I was I was asked, I was in Siena, Italy, a couple of years ago, and with a gathering of the of GARN, the Global Alliance for the Rights of Nature, and someone asked, "How can we justify rights of nature to people? How can we make it so that it doesn't just seem like a bias in favor of nature?" And the answer is, the bias isn't protecting reality. The bias is destroying it. That the bias is the law that gives permission and coerces actual opposition to reality. I mean, it's in some ways a mental illness
Mm.
that is rooted in what I identify as the addiction of materialism. You know, when you think about materialism, what is it? It materialism as substance abuse is, I mean, that is the definition. Substance abuse is materialism. It's attachment to certain materials, and the attachments that are made in our culture are intimate. They're extensions of personality. Property is actually called in the law a type of personality. They're extensions of a human being's personality who owns them and legally protected as such. Now, that's a bizarre thing to say. If I said, no, I can't exist without my heroin, then I'm going to be referred to as having an illness, a disease of some sort. If I say that we can't exist as a society without allowing monopoly control over the surface of the planet and all of its resources, as they're called, um, we're not considered to be judgmental. We're not we don't think of it as an illness. But if we actually call it out, then that is being judgmental. You must be crazy or a socialist or a communist because you don't have to know anything about economic theories of socialism or communism or anything. They have nothing to do with the simple common sense that human beings are part of, integrated into and integral to the ecosystems in which they live. We
Mhm.
can live for 3 minutes without air, disconnected from the atmosphere. We can live for 3 days without water, disconnected from the water bodies on Earth. We can live for 3 weeks without food, the nourishment that comes from the earth. That's it. That's how we're tethered to the natural world. We are part of it, and it's part of us. I live nearby the Lehigh River in Pennsylvania. My drinking water comes from the Lehigh River. 55% or more of my body is made up of water. I'm actually, a majority of me is the Lehigh River. Now, we don't usually talk about it that way, but that's an actually empirically provable fact.
Yeah.
Property isn't. Social privileges aren't. So when we're told, when people that we work with in Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund, my organization, when we organize in a community and we talk with them about their right to protect their land base, their right to say no to fracking or to the next landfill or to a new set of million square feet warehouses, they actually have more legitimate cause to argue and to protect that land base, which is part of them and they're part of it, than any coerced version of so-called rights in property. And so when a corporation comes to town and says, we have a property right, we have a lease on this land, or we own it, or we have a mineral claim here, and that the courts then decide in litigation that the corporate claim to that land is superior to the human beings who live within that community, that place-based community. What we have is a bastardization, not of the ideals of the American Revolution, but of reality.
Mm.
And when our community members go to public hearings to oppose issuance of permits for environmentally destructive activities by corporations, they're told to sit down. They don't have any standing. They don't have any grievance with law. Who has the grievance? The corporation, because its property rights are being violated if the municipality or the county enacts a law that says no fracking here, no dumping here, no water withdrawals here, no aerial spraying of pesticides here. You name it, all of the different things, the site fights that are happening across this country and have been for a century and more.
Mm-hmm.
Their rights have been denied for that long in order to build the empire that we see before us crumbling today. And there hasn't been an empire that didn't go the same way.
Nope. I like to say pipelines leak and empires crumble. Yeah, and it's very clear, like you're talking about property. And of course, that's a very fluid concept that has changed many times since its inception, just like borders. Borders constantly changed. Yet we're taught that there are these infallible and solid and stationary lines on a map. But, people used to be property. Now that's no longer considered legally sanctioned, but it was. So the idea of property is just, it's absolutely made up, because if it wasn't made up, it couldn't just be changed by the flick of a pen. And this really speaks to that paradigm that you've talked about. And I wanted to dig into that a little bit more, because you write in the conclusion that the rights for nature wasn't about winning legal precedent, that you weren't, quote, so much engaged in a legal strategy as we were testing a theory of experiential education and cultural change, end quote. So the problem is really that we not only don't see most of our fellow humans as part of a community, but we certainly don't see the environment as part of our community. Or as you write, environment and community are unnaturally separated. And at a time like this, when so many are so understandably afraid of losing the rights that they think they have, how do you see organizing for natural rights as a goal or a paradigm shift? How do you see that working in parallel with this push for recognizing and respecting our basic human rights?
Well, at CELDEF, we tried mightily for years to work with people and communities to enact local laws that challenged the false premises of our society and of federal and state law. Of course, the courts weren't going to side with those communities. And we were honest with them when we began organizing in those communities to say, we don't expect that this law is going to withstand legal challenge, but you should do it anyway. And part of the reason is because our minds have been so colonized, not just the land, but our own minds. The furrows of our brains and they're like farm furrows where the seeds of deceit have been sown from the time of our birth. And we've been raised to believe things that just aren't so. And so I don't know who first said it, but I like the statement that says, don't believe everything you think. Because we have been taught, the Cartesian philosophy without getting too deep into that kind of stuff. But I think, therefore I am. It's as though it's an identity with our own thoughts. We're saying we are our thoughts in that idea. We're not our thoughts. Our thoughts are cultural. They come from our parents, who were raised similarly to ourselves and taught things that just weren't so. Here I am, and just to age myself approximately, I was not born in this century. But also, were I born in the 14th century in France, I would have probably a different personality and definitely different beliefs and thoughts about what's real in the world. So that suggests that our brains are like your laptop, until you actually put a program in it, some kind of a system that will let you do something with it. It's nothing but the hardware. Same with our brains. When we born into a culture, our brains are programmed. And I don't mean that we're machines. We're far from machines, and we're far more interesting and fascinating than that. And it is possible for us to reprogram ourselves. That's the beauty of it, that we have a free will, or whatever you want to call it, because there's so many arguments, you do or you don't. But experientially, we can prove to ourselves that it's possible to challenge the beliefs that we're carrying around in our heads, and that we can begin to think differently. And, when we believe something, I like to say we also believe it. We live according to our deep beliefs. We act as though they are true. And so, to your question about what do I tell people in communities? Okay, you're going to pass this law. It's not going to be upheld. But what are we going to do then? I mean, what's the point? What's the point? And to me, the answer is, at first, we have to challenge what we believe. We have to decolonize our own minds. And that can't just be done persuasively. I am convinced that it's not, although, I wrote a book, I wrote essays, and I've written other books. It's words, that's true. They're they're intended to be kind of a different programming language than the one that we've been given. But the words themselves aren't going to do it. There's experiential learning that's much more, it goes much deeper, and it's much more effective. And so, what more effective way than to gather people in their local community? They've all agreed that there's something horrible coming down the pike, and that the coercion of the law is going to force it on them, whether or not they like it. What now? Actually writing a law that says what you want instead of begging for what you think you can get from the system, actually acting as if you already are part of your local ecosystem, and you are acting on the premise based on reality and experience that you and your ecosystem are continuum, that there aren't those lines, there aren't borders, there aren't property lines, there aren't separations. We can't find them. I'm taking in the atmosphere in my lungs just to be able to communicate with you. I'm working as part of the earth in that process, in everything I do. But I don't know that just by thinking it. And no one could talk me into it without me thinking about those words and then actually experiencing what's happening when I breathe or when I drink water, or all of it. So why not walk people through kind of the den of lions of the law, and say, we're going to pass a law, and there should be nothing controversial about saying that the river, we're claiming that it has the right to be protected from being killed, from all the life in it being destroyed. And so do we, and our children and future generations. That shouldn't be a controversial thing. And yet it is. It's not a matter of controversy for the law. The law has decided that they're worthless and groundless arguments. And so how do you persuade or convince people raised in this culture, that they actually have fundamental rights that are being denied by the system itself, and that the Bill of Rights that now belongs to corporations as though they were actual persons does not belong to human beings, because when they compete with corporations over those same rights, property rights win. And corporations are property, the highest good in the United States. So really, it is the experiential learning that is the most salient part of the work we've done in drafting local laws and helping communities to enact them, go to court, defend them, get shot down and be told, go home, sit down, be quiet. This is above your pay grade. You don't have the right to make this call. But who in the world has more expertise about the community those people live in and the livability of it and the quality of life than the people living there? Nobody. You go to the hearings and the environmental agency spokesperson says, you just have to trust the science. Because we've done the scientific studies. You have to trust the science. You're not expert enough. You don't understand that, 10,000 parts per million of this toxin isn't going to kill off all life, and you can drink it and not die. You'd have to live to 200 years for this to make you sick. And so trust the science. But it's actually not the science they're asking you to trust. They're asking you to trust the judgment being made based on the science. They're asking you to trust the applied science, not the pure science. And the applied science always has a bias. And under our law, the bias is in favor of profit and property, expansion of profit holding, empire building, in other words.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So what's the point? To me, that's it. And we have more people with their eyes opened about how the American system of law actually works and who it works for, not them.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we're seeing a lot more of that. As I like to say, that our current times are not a change in empire, it's a revealing. And I think a lot of people are recognizing that the friendly facade is off of empire. It is what it is. And I kind of have, as we wrap up here, I have a bit of like a two-part question, because when I was reading your book, I was thinking of many of my own experiences. Speaking of experiential, for instance, when I was down in Louisiana fighting the Bayou Bridge pipeline, which is the tail end of the DAPL project, there was a saying down in the swamps that a law is only as good as its enforcement. So, for instance, if we won an injunction like a stop work order, we would still go out to the site and surveil and document, because you could be assured that they would be working even though there was a work order, because they knew, oh, what are they going to do? They're going to give us a fine because we worked through a stop work order. Who cares? And so the law was only as good as the enforcement. And we knew that, the cops who were also moonlighting as pipeline construction workers were not going to be on our side. And I also appreciate that in the book, you talk about the rights of nature as a waypoint as opposed to a destination. And the indigenous anarchist, creative organizer, and writer Cleve Benally wrote in his book about how the push for rights of nature ignores, although you don't, but a lot of the time ignores the fact that these rights would be codified within the same system that's destroying nature, including human nature. So as we wrap up here, I'm curious, do you see it possible to have a destination that truly recognizes nature as a part of us, as kin, and we are part of it, within the confines of the current United States experiment and experience?
The simple answer to that is no, not within the context of the existing United States of America. It's a continent spanning empire with military bases in, I don't know the exact number now, but 167 is a number that comes to mind, nations around the world. This is not the kind of a basis on which to build right relationship with the natural world and with our neighbors, our human neighbors. It's just not. Now, am I calling for the dissolution of the United States of America? I don't have to. It's inevitable. And I say that based on history. There are ruins around the globe in the Western Hemisphere, the Eastern Hemisphere, all around. And those, what I think of is when I look at beautiful, magnificent monuments, pyramids, and ziggurats, all of the things, they're like coral reefs, dead ones. That's what's left after the life's been washed out of them. And when the life's been washed out, that's actually the end point and the goal of empire. It's anti-life. That is the end game. And the fact that after so many different civilizations have come and gone, human beings haven't remembered that lesson from any of them. That sounds horrible. And so I'm going to contradict myself and say, I think we have remembered. Some people have. The indigenous people around the world that we hear from and that we recognize the echoes of our own pasts. My grandparents, your grandparents, and I mean far grandparents, were indigenous to a place, and they had a certain relationship with it. I'm not saying that everyone's cultural symbolism and that, how they express that relationship is true and empirically provable. That's not the point. It's not about what's empirically provable. It's not about reductionism, which I talk about in the book too, which is a false premise for understanding living systems. Reductionism is great for understanding mechanical systems. It's not good for understanding how generative living systems that create emergent properties that can't be predicted from the elements that go into making up an organism, for instance, or a society. We can't predict those outcomes, those generative outcomes, because that's not what our science does. And so we are left to actually, really what it comes down to is we actually have to have the experience with our neighbors and with our environment, actually live in that relationship. Today, we're taught not to live in it, but to have this step back, we're superior and separate. But really, that's just a simple way of saying we abstract things in our heads. We use words that are empty of empirical content, democracy included, words we like, they're, and I didn't mean that just sarcastically. The idea of democracy, well, what is it? The idea of property, what is it? I was listening to arguments from academics recently about how it's really difficult to credit indigenous systems of society and relationship with nature when they bring in spirits and things like that, the spirit of nature or the spirits of the trees and so forth. They're not empirical existing things. And how can we credit that and then bring that into Western law and make sense of it? And my answer is, wait, how do we create this relationship with material world we call property? And most of our law and 90% of our litigation is around property relationships. And yet all of the satellites in space, when they look down at the surface of the Earth, they can't see one property line. They can't see one national border. They don't exist in empirical reality. So our spirits, our ghosts are things like property. And we can't even see that we're arguing, no spirits, we can't have that in the law, when our whole law is nothing but air. It's based on a made up relationship with the natural world. So it's a conundrum, and we need to have a paradigm shift. And is it possible for this society to evolve into, and I'm going to say devolve. And I don't mean that we're going to go backwards in evolution. More like devolve, we're going to take the power of the state and put it in the hands of the community. so they can decide what happens to themselves. That's called self-determination, the ideals of the revolutionaries that was rejected. Well, let's stop rejecting it. Let's actually go back and have the American Revolution succeed. And let's see where that goes. Nothing's going to be perfect. The argument isn't that we're creating a utopia.
Mm.
The argument is we're going to try to create right relationship with each other. And when I say each other, that includes, as our Native American friends would say, our brothers and sisters that aren't human, the forelegs, the winged creatures, the swimmers. All of those are our relatives. And how can we say we're not? They're not. Our genes are shared with them.
Yeah,
Yes, they've been modified, but so what? We're related. They're
absolutely.
family.
And you remind me of Jenny Odell writes about how the destruction of something can actually be constructive and can actually bring back something that used to exist. So, for instance, the destruction of a dam can bring back something that had been destroyed in the name of empire or in the name of a colonization or what have you. And so thinking about the destruction or the devolution of our system is not about thinking about being Luddites and, all of that, but actually bringing back something that has been destroyed, that has been buried, that has been taken from us collectively. So I think that, yeah, that's a necessary and not just like a beautiful concept, but a necessary one for survival. So,
Right, right. I have no doubt that there will continue to be competition, but there will not be if we can succeed in moving in this direction of right relationship with each other and the rest of the world, that we can find that parasitism on the earth is not the only way for humans to live, that it's possible to live symbiotically.
yeah, absolutely.
And it isn't, it may be impossible for humans to survive extinction, because that's what happens to species that aren't able to get along with their surroundings.
Absolutely. Cancer kills the host and itself ultimately. Um, so Ben, thank you so much. That was really powerful and important interview. Thank you so much. Folks can check out the book. It's called Wouldn't You Say? It's a collection of essays about environment and community by Ben Price of CELDF. Thank you again. That's a Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund. I always say I don't do well with acronyms, and there I was using one without explaining it. So folks, do check that out. Wouldn't you say? It's eye-opening even for somebody like me who does this stuff all of the time. So thank you again so much, Ben, for writing this and for taking the time to sit down with us today.
Thank you, Eleanor. Enjoyed it. Thank you.